In a moment, we've more of your comments on BBC programmes in feedback. But first, a message for drivers using the M56 in Cheshire. As you may have heard earlier, a serious accident has closed the M56 between junctions 12 and 14. The eastbound carriageway is closed between 14 and 12, and the westbound carriageway closure has been further extended to between junction 11, that's the A56 to Manchester and Preston Brook, and junction 14, the A5117 to North Wales. We're told that long delays are to be expected, and you're urged to find an alternative route to avoid this part of the M56 if you possibly can. And wherever you're driving this morning, please do take care. And now, Feedback, the programme in which you put your views on BBC programmes and policy. It's presented by Tom Vernon.
Upon the hearth a fire is red, beneath the roof there is a bed, but not yet weary are our feet, still round the corner we may meet. A sodden tree or standing stone, that none have seen but we alone.
Should Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have programmes which none can hear but them alone? But we begin today's feedback with a swan song.
Tree and flower and leaf and grass, let them pass, let them pass. Hill and water under sky, pass them by, pass them by.
As a follow-up to last week's programme concerning the new production of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I would like to raise a question. Why has the music composed by Donald Swann, and with the full sanction of Tolkien himself, been disregarded in favour of fresh compositions?
In answer to Mr. Rycroft, who wrote from Malmesbury, the producer Jane Morgan says she wanted the music to be consistent and not chop and change between two composers. Jane Morgan was criticised last week for her policy on accents, but R.D. Coates from Edinburgh supports her, taking issue with the man who wrote to us and said that Radio 4's Hobbits sounded much too middle class and not nearly rural enough.
I think his comments are both absurd and unfair, and betray an ignorance of shire matters. The Bagginses, the Tookes and the Brandybucks are the principal families in the land. Indeed, Pippin is the son of the Thane, the nearest thing the shire has to a king. So the use of BBC accents is a perfectly valid interpretation.
Now I've got used to the Lord of the Rings voices, I like them.
Mrs. R. Bulmer wrote to us from Leeds on the letterhead of the local Cats Protection League, except that she had cats crossed out in favour of
Hobbits.
She obviously has a sharp eye for anything that's hairy.
The Hobbit at the front of the Radio Times had human feet, not hobbit feet. Obviously the artist hadn't read Lord of the Rings.
If you remember the book, when it comes to feet, hobbits have hairy ones. Hairy or not, rather a lot of people put their foot down last week on the subject of BBC local radio, whose presence looms like a shadowy but gigantic question mark over the report on possibilities for the future of all BBC radio, which we've been talking about recently. It may be that people who listen to Radio 4 and people who like local radio are completely separate audiences, but we're still waiting for the avalanche of mail from enthusiasts, though John Horton from Stowmarket and Eunice Smith from Bournemouth were among those who found a little to say in its favour.
I, for one, prefer the local BBC Radio Norwich to the IBA Radio Orwell.
Local radio is good in emergencies, such as flooding, blizzards, train or bus cancellations.
I'm not sure it's enough. We've heard again from Jim Hawkins of Leamington Spa. He's a radio enthusiast, but for the commercial variety. Last week he said the BBC ought to get out of the field altogether and leave it to independent local radio. You may recall that something similar has been heard occasionally in the past about popular BBC television programmes from the direction of ITV. Although wedded to ILR, in a spirit of public inquiry, Mr. Hawkins has been allowing his ears to have carnal knowledge of BBC Radio Birmingham.
Further to my letter of last Friday, I heard this on BBC Radio Birmingham.
A record show.
And you say you like Fleetwood Mac?
Which sounds like this.
Loving you isn't the right thing to do.
And Thin Lizzy.
Example?
There goes Moses carrying his Bible book.
Well, we've got a very nice record coming up for you, from the Seekers, in fact.
I've got a never-ending love for you. From now on, that's all I want to do.
Just who is the radio station for? Perhaps the 94% of people who don't listen to BBC local radio have sent in requests and been played a record which has been not only something other than that requested, but something utterly different.
When asked why they served cottage pie when the customer wanted curry, BBC Radio Birmingham said that record request programmes as such were off. Most BBC local radio stations do what are technically known as dedications, in which the listeners get their names read out in connection with a record the presenter has chosen. The manager at BBC Radio Birmingham added that they tended to think of themselves as more in the self-service line of business, which supports what Bill Jackson wrote to us about Radio Medway on the letterhead of an appeal for the disabled.
The fact that I'm writing on this particular sheet of paper is no accident. Radio Medway has taken the trouble to help me put this scheme over to the people of Kent, whereas radios 1, 2, 3 and 4 decline to mention it.
So, if BBC local radio has the news of blizzards and traffic and puts on the right records in a professional manner and encourages good works, is that enough? Or is there something else that it's doing or can do to justify its existence? You tell me. And how small is local anyway? People's ideas seem to differ.
Give up local radio altogether. What little local flavour it has is not enough to justify the expense of running it.
H.D. Hannam writes from Harrogate. From Warminster, Mrs. Butcher.
Local radio may be okay for urban areas, but it's not local here. We couldn't care less about news for the Yeovil or the Bristol area. It's too far away.
I get all my local news from our village shop and local paper.
M.P. Brooke from Hull, a listener to Radio Cheese Counter. But then you find someone like Helen Mead, living in Bideford, who likes something far wider-ranging.
I was horrified to hear yesterday on feedback that your correspondents didn't like their local radio programmes. All I can say is that they haven't had the opportunity to listen to our really splendid one, Morning Sou' West, based at Plymouth. Over 2 hours of good and varied entertainment, Monday to Friday, general and local news headlines, full local bulletins, and the news from London at 7 and 8 a.m.
And she adds a whole list of auditory delights, including the tide tables. But that morning show isn't, as it happens, from a local radio station in the ordinary sense of the word. It's a regional alternative to Radio 4. It's all very complicated.
It would seem that some listeners confuse the developing role of local radio with the roles of national, regional and network radio.
Not only listeners, me. J.H. Bowes, writing from Perth, points out that local radio isn't just a smaller version of network radio, it is something different.
We're only at the beginnings. It will become increasingly a more immediate and personal service to communities with greater involvement by individuals and agencies. It will carve out a quite indispensable place in the life of local communities.
But some areas, you see, aren't going to have local radio on the English pattern.
Here in Scotland, we have what they call a national regional radio, which is in effect one channel for the whole of Scotland called Radio Scotland.
Jimmy Brown from Inverurie, Aberdeenshire, doesn't want that one channel, but more local stations like England.
To provide a superior service in one area, England, while charging the rest of us the full licence fee is indefensible.
So in our continuing discussion of the BBC Working Party report of possibilities for the future of radio, we now have to consider the national regions. To start with, what are they? Michael Brooke is the secretary of the Welsh National Region, and on the Working Party, he had to speak up for the other two national regions as well.
National regions are a term which the BBC, I think, uniquely uses to describe Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The BBC obviously can't make up its mind whether they're regions or nations, so it splits the difference.
That's extremely tactful of it. But, what about the stations themselves? Are they on the level of national radio or local radio, or here again does the BBC split the difference?
It's somewhere in the middle. They operate in a conventional way as opposed to local radio, which developed completely new operating systems in the late 1960s. The reason for this is that they've got a different job to do. They're serving countries which have their own identity within the United Kingdom, and it's perceived that there's a need for a certain weight of programs. I'm thinking of programs like current affairs, documentaries, plays and so on, which at present isn't attempted at any rate on the same scale by local radio in England. I think it would be misleading to regard them as the same as local radio.
Why have we got national regional radio in some areas but not others?
At the time when the future of BBC radio was under discussion, which culminated in the document broadcasting in the 70s, You'll recall that in England there were 3 main regions, and it was decided at that time that these regions didn't really form sensible communities to be served separately by broadcasting regions. And in the national regions, the broadcasting councils in particular agreed that they wanted to continue as separate identifiable regions in the way that was not being proposed in England.
So it's the choice of the people in those regions?
Absolutely.
But if I may put to you a point which is made to me about Scotland, it comes from Jimmy Brown in Aberdeenshire, and I know you're in Wales and it's unfair to put it to you, but all the same, he says, this national regional programme was inaugurated with a pop, prattle and phone-in policy at the time of the great wavelength reshuffle, but it proved such a disaster that it had to be realigned largely to Radio 4. I mean, has regional radio been a success?
Well, you've taken the particular case of Radio Scotland, which did realign itself fairly dramatically at that time and, as the correspondent says, has retrenched to a certain extent. The problems aren't quite so acute elsewhere. Radio Ulster, for example, is the most successful station which the BBC runs outside London in terms of the proportion of the population which listens to it. And we've recently had some figures for Radio Cymru, which show that of the target audience, i.e. the people who speak Welsh, it is by far and away the most popular radio station being broadcast.
But can we be sure that the national regions will be able to sustain this heavier weight of programming? Because, in fact, surely they won't actually have enough money. I mean, it looks from this report of the Working Party as if they're being talked of on the same level as local radio. For instance, a sustaining service is mentioned which might serve both the national regions and local radio.
Yes, that is only one of the options, and in fact it is not the option which the Working Party came out in favour of. Radio Ulster and Radio Wales are only broadcasting for something like 60 hours a week, as opposed to most local radio stations, certainly the older ones, which are broadcasting for 75 hours a week. We have ambitions to increase the number of hours of our services, and indeed the broadcasting councils are on record as wanting eventually full-time services. That is, of course, sometime in the future. It'll cost a fair bit of money.
Michael Brook. The recommendation in the report from the Working Party on the future of radio recognises the national region's aim of more airtime, but other things must come first, it says. All the engineering work for a really good VHF transmission network, all the English local stations planned to cover the country with a total of 38, and as many little opt-out stations in the national regions as resources allow. Some of these are as small as to have a staff of no more than 4 people. Scotland would have 13 on current proposals from Shetland downwards. 5 are working already, with between half an hour and 1 3/4 hours of their own programmes a day. Wales would have 10, Northern Ireland half a dozen. So there is yet another possibility to think about if you're considering writing to the Managing Director Radio with your ideas on the future of BBC Radio, as he's asked you to. That is, if you can tear yourself away from the television news.
Angela Rippon, oh, won't you be mine every evening around about 9?
Flog publicly and then boil in oil the cretin responsible for Thursday morning's 6-minute break in transmission during Richard Stilgoe's Grand National Traffic Jam show.
Well, it was 7 minutes, actually, and caused by a drop in mains power at which the Droitwich transmitters for radios 1, 3 and 4 all shut off automatically to avoid doing themselves an injury.
Apologies are not enough. The very least you can do, oh fat man on a bicycle, is to play the Angela Rippon song in its entirety. After all, we've only heard it 1.5 times.
Sorry, oh Cynthia Dummett of Begonia Close in Basingstoke. We haven't time for all of the remaining half. All I can manage is 19.466% of what's left, leaving some 40.27% of the total song unrepeated. Though perhaps if you wrote to television news, they could oblige with the rest when they're not talking about politics and wars or things of that sort.
Angela Rippon, oh, won't you be mine every evening around about 9? I love the way that your eyebrows incline. Angela Rippon, oh, won't you be mine?
Feedback was 100% presented by Tom Vernon and produced by John Screen. And if you've any points you'd like to make about BBC programmes or policy, the address to which to send your letters is Feedback, Broadcasting House, London W1A 4WW.